everyone. After that very exciting musical introduction, which is a little bit grandiose for this chat. Hello, my name is Kuan Hian. I'll be moderating this Fireside chat today. Today we're going to be talking about the future of work at Gov Insider's Festival of Innovation. And we'll be talking about everything from what work might look like 10 or 20 years from now, what sort of skills new employees are going to need in the future, what sort of technologies are going to play a big role in the nature of work, and all sorts of other things. And today I'm very excited to have with us our two panelists. The first of which is Mr. Rahul Daswani. He's the Head of People and Culture at Open Government Products, GovTech Singapore. And the second of which is Mr. Shazly Zain, whom I will call Shaz for his request, who's a research assistant at the Institute of Policy Studies at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in US. So hello Shaz and hi Rahul. I think we'll just dive straight into it because early on when chatting, had a great time. So let's just dive straight into the first question. A general question, lay the groundwork, which is, when you guys envision the future of work 10 or 20 years from now, what do you see and what do you think the biggest differences will be?
I think I can go first. Is that right?
Yeah, sure.
Right, sure. Since we are on the panel about future work and hybrid employment, it'll be remiss of me to not say that I think within 5 years, actually, we're going to see hybrid employment as like the established model of employment, right? So I think the second part really is about what is the biggest difference. And the way to think about that biggest differences, let's go back to the research that's being done today by people like myself, people within the corporate sector as well. And right now, the research is all about understanding how this mode of employment is taking place, right? We've heard things like, for example, remote employment, hybrid employment, gig economy, digital economy. These are all largely semantics. They're all roughly referring to the same thing, things like pertaining to autonomy, independence, flexibility in your working environment, right? So that is sort of what a lot of these things are alluding to. For the purpose of this, I'm just going to call it hybrid employment, but you can sub it in if, however we want to do it. But the other thing also we need to start thinking about is the economic models, the markets, be it the labor market, be it the products and services. How do companies operate in tandem with this hybrid employment model? How do people work in this system? What motivates people to work? Quick example, today, if you hear one of your colleagues say, I'm going to quit my job because I'm mentally very tired. That's kind of normal, isn't it? You go back like 5 years ago and people will think, wow, you're crazy or what? You want to quit your job just because you're mentally tired, right? It's not a thing, right? But now you notice that the motivations people have to work has started to change, and it will continue to change within the next 5 to 10 years. We also need to think about how it affects different groups of people. Earlier on, I was talking about the fact that I look at food delivery riders as well as content creators. These are two very different groups of people, but they are also hybrid employees. And because of that, the whole notion, the whole system of hybrid employment affects them differently. Certain industries, obviously, you would know, have that possibility of hybrid employment, but certain industries don't have. And then you can start talking about the class differences and things like that, right? Inequality now is a big thing. One of the very interesting things that I realize that people don't talk about is that there are fundamental definitions that we take for granted that will change. For example, dealing with content creators, what is an employer and what is an employee, for example? You realize our entire culture is premised on salaried employment. Salaried employment is something we all know about. It's just we go to work, we get paid every month. That's the normal system that we have. But you realize that our entire culture is based on that, right? Things like weekday and weekend, office hours, 9 to 6, 9 to 5, overtime, things like that. You realize they're all predicated on salaried employment. And our social policies and whatnot, all of it predicated on salaried employment. So what you realize over time is that the big difference that you will see is we will need to redevelop an entire support structure. What are the norms, what are the policies, be both corporate and public policies, so that we can establish hybrid employment as a go-to system of employment. Rahul, what do you think about it?
Yeah, thanks, Shaz. So I do think you're right. So my first point is quite related to yours, and I'll expand it a little bit. So I have 3 points, right? So the first is, yes, hybrid work. I think of it as a lot more autonomy in terms of both when people work, but also where people work, right? So you can work from home, you can work from somewhere else. That's really up to you. The focus is really going to be on three things, right? So the focus is going to be on outcomes. What are the outcomes if you agree with whether you're a salaried employee or whatever arrangement you have? What are the outcomes? Two, how do we prioritize what you need to do? Because there's also going to be a lot of agility that's going to be required, a lot of changing requirements. So how do we do the prioritization, and what frequency do we do the prioritization? And third, for the employee or the person who's decided to enter into that arrangement, what is the benefit, right? Especially in terms of development. So what is the learning that I'm going to get? What is the growth that I'm going to get as a result of being a part of this arrangement? That's going to factor in whether I enter into a contract or an arrangement with an employer or an organization or institute or not, right? I think right now we have fairly traditional ways of doing it. So I work at OGP in the day, but I also volunteer with the Sydney Youth Club in the evening, and I teach adaptive leadership with the Center for Asian Leadership, which is a nonprofit, on weekends sometimes, right? So that's more traditional arrangements. But like Shaz is saying, these can be upended, because if I was to say, as long as I commit to certain deliverables for OGP, why not I be more flexible with my time and maybe spend the time on other stuff also, as long as I can deliver my deliverables? Who cares, right? So I think that's the first part, which is the hybrid work, but I would expand it to talk about autonomy and the relationship. Certainly, like Shaz said, I agree, it's kind of different between the employer and the employee, or whatever terms we choose to use. The second is that I think one of the big manifestations of differences we will see is people hiring for skills rather than qualifications, right? So that is beginning to happen right now in the tech sector, and it's with the revolutionization of online education that this is able to happen. But also it's because people can make tests for cheap, and people are willing to do the test. And I'm not just talking about coding tests, right? I'm interviewing for positions in the corporate side of open government products. We run case studies, for example, like consulting firms have been doing for years. And these are really helpful in gauging aptitude and a much better proxy for competence than the education, the certificate, or the qualifications of somebody, right? And I think as we develop further, we'll have better and better proxies. And so you won't have to rely on education and institution as a proxy for quality. You can get much better proxies of skill through immediate tests that people will have to do that won't take a long period of time. So I think that's the second big shift that is starting to happen, but happen in a big way soon. And the third thing is, I think, something to do with mindsets. So you've all heard of the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset, and I think that's something that's fairly established. But we also have to think about different mindsets. We have to move away from the expert mindset where somebody always knows the answer to how can we be more curious and collaborative? Who do we need to ask? What are the questions we need to ask? Who do we need to collaborate with to develop the answer? Because the answer isn't pre-existing, especially with something like COVID. I mean, how do we figure out what the collective answer is to deal with COVID in this age? It's not the same thing as dealing with the Spanish flu, because we have different technologies and we have different ways of combating COVID in a way that we did in the past, right? So we have to discover the answer together as a collective society. There are other mindset change that I won't go into that much, but thinking about scarcity a lot. We think about material scarcity, but we have technology. And so how do we have an abundance mindset with that and other types of resources that are not necessarily scarce so that we can use those to develop solutions? How do we move from a reactive mindset? And we're always thinking about reacting. And an example of this is our supply chains are quite just in time. We moved to just in time, but we realize now that, oh, actually, maybe that's not such a good model. Maybe we should be a bit more resilient, right? And so what does it mean to have a more creative or proactive way of doing things so that we're insured for the future? So these are just some of the mindset change, but we need to reconfigure how our mind works in order to deal with this new world and new economy that Shaz is talking about.
Yeah, I think those are great series of related points. I'd also maybe zoom in on something both of you alluded to, which is there's going to be a change in how we conceptualize work, and the change in how we conceptualize work leads to a change in how we conceptualize and organize our entire lives, basically. That's what labor under capitalism is like. But so what sort of new skills do you think are going to help people, or are people going to need to succeed in the future of work in that way? Whether it be skills related to mindsets or skills in the more technical sense, which Rahul alluded to. So what sort of skills do you think people are going to need, maybe both in the public sector, but also in the private sector in the future?
I think maybe I can start off by talking about it from a more broad perspective, right? What are the skill sets that are needed by everyone? And sort of maybe you look at it from an individual perspective. So there are 2 points from an individual's perspective. One, I feel that you should be pursuing skill sets that firstly align to your personal interests, and two, align to your work interests. There's an underlying assumption I'm making. I hope that your career interests are also in line with your personal interests, because let's be real, you do not want to be stuck in a job you hate. I hope that's not the case. So again, individually, go for the skills that you want to go for and are related to your work, hopefully. Then let's go a little bit more macro, right? Let's talk about society, maybe at a national level. Honestly speaking, you want all the skills. I know there's a lot of conversation about soft skills, about coding and things like that. Look, let's be real. You want all of the skills. It is absolutely naive to think that you only need a small subset of skills to get things done, right? And I want the audience, and maybe for all of us, to start thinking about this. Let me put this scenario. You just woke up this morning. You just woke up and you got out of bed. Now, I want you to think about the skills that went into making that bed that you woke up from. Think about the skills that went into the room that you're waking up in. Think about the skills. I'm assuming you're using your phone as an alarm. Think about the skills that went into it, right? And that's just the basic. You realize that even the simple act of waking up, you realize that there's so many skills that help society function, right? And this is true for any society. You need that diversity in terms of skill sets. But I think, if I may just extend the question a little bit more, the bigger questions. The first question, and I think this is particularly important, is the question of how do we value those skill sets? I think COVID is a very good example, right? When we realized that the nurses were not paid as high as we thought they were, what was everyone's reaction? Well, they're aimed right in it. And we were all like, we were all not happy about it. We were talking about, clapping is not enough. And we sort of pressured, and the nurses, I think they got the pay raise, if I'm not mistaken. Our cleaners, let us take the time to recognize that our cleaners, rags and bottle of Dettol spray in hand, were our frontline soldiers against COVID-19. And when we realized that their pay wasn't as high as we thought they were, well, we were up in arms. And I think now there is the wage model, the progressive wage model that has increased their salary. If you realize that prices and wages actually reflect on what we think is important. And so over time, you realize during the COVID and post-COVID, there is going to be this tension where you see some skill sets that were previously overvalued and some skill sets that were previously undervalued. You're going to see that difference in price. That price is going to be reflected in the wages for those skill sets. So how it goes about, I'm not sure. I am more inclined to let the prices play out on their own and let people organically come up with the equilibrium, if I were to use economics here. But yeah, that's one of the main problems. The second problem, and I'm sort of alluding to Rahul's earlier point. Since I'm from NUS, a lot of people immediately think about education. And the question here is, how do you teach those skills, regardless of what those skills are? And I don't just mean within universities and polytechnics, IT, schools in general. I don't just mean Udemy, Coursera, all these online courses. I mean in real life. Experiences can be a very good teacher as well. I certainly learned a lot during my time at IPS. And I think one of the key concerns that I sort of started to realize as we're delving into the whole hybrid model is that there is a difficulty in understanding the difference between solution-focused questions as well as problem-based questions. So let me give the example, right? Again, because it's NUS, everyone's talking about interdisciplinary learning. And the question that is always posed is, how do we introduce interdisciplinary learning in our curriculum? Right, that's the question. A lot of you would think, oh, that's a problem-based question, because the problem at the core of that question is interdisciplinary learning. But that's not true. It's actually a solutions-based question. If you realize interdisciplinary learning is actually a solution to an existing problem. So why is that problem? And this is maybe even more relevant now in hybrid employment. The problems that we face today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow are going to be increasingly challenging and going to be increasingly complex. And it requires us to both have that specialization in that particular subject field, as well as like a broad-based knowledge so that you can pull ideas all over the place. So I think in the education conversations, it's the T-shaped graph. You need both the breadth as well as the depth. So the question here is, how on earth do you teach that? Be it in the school, be it online, or be it at the workplace. How do you teach that? I don't know. It's what we call a wicked problem. Because to solve that wicked problem, you have to solve all other problems. But in order to solve all other problems, you must solve this one central problem. Thank God I'm not an educator. But so TLDR, too long didn't read for people who are unaware. What skills do we need? Individually, go for the skills that that interest you. And I hope it's also aligned to your career. Society, you want all the skills. You want all of the skills. But the bigger question here is, one, how do we value that skills? And two, how do we teach that skills? Yeah. Rahul.
Thanks, Shaz. So I'm going to pick up on one of their points, right? And I agree. I would love to focus for people to focus on the intersection of skills that are important to them and important to the organization. You know, the thing that I find interesting in today's world is it's not entirely clear for the individual what skills are important to them. You know, and I think it's a function largely of the amount of time that we're able to spend occupied, distracted sometimes, doing anything. And so as a result, we don't spend nearly as much time reflecting as we did in the past, right? Journaling is a good form of reflection, but there are other ways. I mean, if you were just bored in the past on a bus, you couldn't take out your mobile phone because you didn't have one, right? And so you would ponder, and that would be an opportunity to reflect. And so therefore, what becomes important as a skill is reflection. Reflection is the output. And I think the skill that's important is coaching, right? Coaching is a particular discipline that people can ask you questions that really help you reflect and uncover new things. And I actually am a strong believer in coaching. I'm a certified coach. And what I really like about coaching, unlike mentorship, somebody tells you about their experience, but that you may be coming from a different context. Your life may have been a different trajectory, you may have access to a different set of resources, you may have a different organization. So their advice is not always, or the way they got to where they are is not always going to be the same way you're going to pursue. So then the question is, what is the best way for you? Fortunately or unfortunately, you are the only expert in your own life. You are the best expert. So what a coach does is ask you questions so you find the answer that is best for you. Right. And so leaders ought to develop this ability to coach to help people find that the intersection of that Venn diagram that Shaz talked about. If you understand yourself and what you're looking for and what skills you want, then you can talk about what is that intersection between the skills I want to develop and what are my organization values, right? So that is the primary skill, I would say. There are two others that I want to cover quickly. The second is, I think, this idea of user research and understanding people. And I know we began that quite a while ago with our Singapore conversations, but the idea is going beyond the conversations, because often what people say is limited, can be limited because they're not sure how the feedback may be taken into account. It may be limited because they actually haven't really fully thought about or digested it. So what you want to do in this is a field called UX, user experience, right? If you go into that, and a product designer will be quite well versed in that, one of the dimensions of that is user research. And so what people do for research is almost always, yes, it involves asking people, hey, what do you want in a product, right? But also involves watching them, because sometimes it's also hard for people to articulate what they want. Sometimes people can't say it. They just don't know how to say it and they don't know it's what they want. But if you watch them, right, with a website or a product. So, you know, for example, if the COVID-19 National Appointment System for Vaccinations, which OGP built, right? Why is it that for us, actually over 50% of seniors were able to book it by themselves? They didn't even need help. Why is that? Because we went down to go find seniors and watch them try and book a vaccine appointment. Right, and then you realize, oh, the buttons need to be bigger, the choices need to be smaller. What are the default settings that allow me to nudge people to go to vaccination centers because they're going to be faster for you to get an appointment and faster if you go through than polyclinics, which you're probably more familiar with, right? How do I change the order? All of these things happen to increase our throughput, but also give people a better experience of the entire process end to end. And this was done primarily because the user research was solid, and then you make a whole bunch of tweaks that allow you to do A/B testing. So some people receive one, some people receive another. or at some point in the past it was this, but at some point in the future it's this, and then you can tell the time it takes for somebody to get through the system, and you can use these tweaks to improve and keep improving the product. And that's the great thing about tech products, but also many products to build now is not that expensive. So actually you would rather test quickly, prototype, figure out what's wrong, fix it, rather than try and build a perfect product. So if you can do your user research really well, both before building a product, but also during and after, then actually there's room for quick iteration and doing really well. And the final skill that I want to talk about is taking experimentation and taking risk. I mean, it's more of a mindset, I suppose, but this idea that, hey, let's take some risk. Let's take some risk. Let's see what pieces of this are non-critical necessarily. And if they fail, it's actually okay. It's not a big deal. This idea of releasing beta versions to the public of products and letting people know it's not going to be perfect. But when Parking.sg was first released, like, let's just release the beta version. And people who are really, really excited about it, developers can test it, tell us what the bugs are. And then after that, we improve it so that when the mass mainstream public uses it, actually it's a great experience. And it's much better than us like trying to work out the best possible product and releasing it. So if there's greater appetite for experimentation and people can understand the social contract between government and citizens such that there is an expectation that actually we'd love to get stuff out faster, but then are you okay with some testing going on first? And let's make sure that that's up front, and then let's go with that. And that's really the best way for things to move forward. So if we can accept that both within government, but also as citizens, then I think there's room for us to develop much faster.
I think those are really interesting. I think Rahul, I'll just zoom in since you work at OGP as head of people and culture there, and you spoke earlier about coaching, and you also I think just spoke about the need for a bit more risk taking, with more experimentation, like against I think what is perceived to be the general government stance, which is we try not to ship things until we think they're like 100% perfect, right? So what are some of the things which I think you've been doing at OGP, both to help develop people there in terms of that coaching sense, which you say, but also try and maybe change the culture and push against that culture to create a bit more risk taking, a bit more experimentation? What are the sort of lessons which maybe the wider public service can learn from what's going on at OGP?
Yeah, sure. Unfortunately, we don't have another half an hour, but I'll say three.
The elevator pitch
that we did. That I think during COVID especially. So one is, I think, improve the communication / collaboration, technology, frequency, and start, right? So when we hit COVID, a couple of things that we did quite quickly is, one, we instituted a daily meeting every day. We never had an office, because in the office, you kind of know what's happening, right? You have this ambient sense of what's going on with other people, and you don't feel that concern. But when you're at home, you're more isolated. And we found that a lot of people were wondering, hey, did anything critical happen today that I just totally missed? And people would have to deal with that tension overnight, right? Or over days, because they just wouldn't be so plugged in until the next time they came to the office, right? So what we did is we had a 6 p.m. meeting, and it's a 5 or 10 minute meeting. Often the meeting is like, nothing critical happened today, right? And then people can be like, okay, I can relax, right? Or it's like, here's a 1 minute update on the thing that happened today. And so at least at 6 p.m., mentally you can relax and say, okay, I know what's happened. I know what to expect. That's one thing that we did that I think is working relatively well. We've shifted that, and now it's like, hey, actually we don't know that much about what's happening with other teams. So maybe so we moved the meeting to 5:30, and we said we'll give each team a roster. So every 3 weeks or so, you present minutes about like, hey, what's been happening over the last 3 weeks. So even though you may not see your colleagues from other teams as often, you actually have a sense of what's going on, right? So this idea of how do you adapt the communication channels and the way in which you collaborate in such a way to give people that sense of community and continuity. That's one. The second is, what are the ways in which you can enable connection in different ways? So people are connected to the organization, because one of the big things you lose with remote, right? And I kind of really wish VR was more developed at this point, because that would be fantastic and kind of the closest thing. Video doesn't quite cut it, but VR, I think, would be a really good substitute to in-person meetings and the global meetings that we'd have to have. So I wish it was there, but in the absence of that, what are the things we can do to maintain connection? And so there are things like, hey, do you do joint workouts? Do we have a happy hour? We have Ask Me Anything now for new hires, which is not something we had in the past, to get people to gel over that. And now people are used to asking questions and doing that. We have a program called Donut, which is an app on Slack. And it just tells you, hey, you're matched with this person. It used to be once a month, match with somebody, go out for a meal. In COVID, what we did, we actually...
It's like speed dating, but for
colleagues.
Yeah,
kind of. 1 hour, so not quite speed dating. And 1 a month. And so in COVID, what we did was we cut it to once every 2 weeks, but we cut the time from 1 hour to half an hour. And so over a month, you actually spend the same amount of time. You still spend 1 hour, but now you're meeting more people. And we increase the number of people when you're doing remote from one other person to 2 other people. So actually now, once a month, you're meeting 4 people randomly, when in the past you would meet only 1 person. So you're more connected and it costs you the same amount of time, right? And so that's one of the ways in which you build connection. And hopefully, I mean, in an ideal world, we don't have to do this and intrinsically connection will happen. But the whole idea of externalities is like, let's just make it as easy as possible for this to happen, and let's scaffold this so it's really, really easy for this to happen, and let's make it happen, right? And then finally, I think there's no really getting away from the human touch and human technology. So you need people to be thinking about how do we deliberately do this, right? So it's not just me or OGP, but actually people who have a passion for this, and OGP often come with ideas, right? And some people run this. Some people are like, hey, I want to run a HIIT every Wednesday for the team. I'm like, all right, let me empower you. Let me enable you to do this. Go for it, right? How do you make, I think the fundamental question in terms of human touch is, the way I think about it is this, how you walk into people's houses sometimes, it's like, this is a house. And you walk to other people's places and it's like, this is a home. And you feel the energy, you feel the environment. What is the equivalent for offices? You walk into some places and it's this big office that is impersonal. And some spaces, what is it? Is it a collaborative team space? Whatever label you want to give it, what is it that empowers that space? And it ought to be a hybrid space, right? So you should be able to connect to it, ideally virtually as well as physically. How do you do that? How do you get people's natural inclinations to make this happen? How do you build that into sustainable programs and take advantage of that? So that's the third thing I'll say that we did, and I'd love to see this more widely applied in the public service. And it's not, in fact, it's not just us. There are many parts of the public service that are trying different aspects of this, and I'd be happy to kind of collaborate and brainstorm with other people also about how to continuously improve to figure out how to best do this.
Yeah, I mean, that all sounds like stuff which, I mean, I would love to see my workplace. I'm sure same for you. I'm not sure how much we're already seeing. I do recall seeing a clip of Facebook's mildly uncanny valley VR meeting which they had with Zuckerberg already looks like a robot, but when you put him in an actual digital avatar, you're like, this seems to fit him a bit better than everyone else. But I mean, speaking of ways to connect and to collaborate, I think, Chaz, before we started, we went live and we were just chatting earlier on. You mentioned that one of the things which you're really interested in talking about was, what sort of role new communications channels, or I guess not new by now, but communication channels such as social media are going to play in the future of work. And obviously they're going to change the extent to which you can do P2P and stuff like that. But so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on these sorts of new communication channels, particularly social media, and how that intersects with the future of work.
I will try to blitz through because I realize it's 4:29 p.m.
Yes.
We've got
an extra 5 minutes. I've finagled it from the organizers, but yeah.
Okay, sure. I think, calling social media as a communications channel is a little bit, I don't know, I'm a bit uncomfortable calling it that, right? For a long time, social media was initially seen as an advertising tool by a lot of companies, right? It's a means of interacting with customers, product pushing and things like that, right? It was an advertising platform. We see that with Instagram with their influencers, right? We see all those paid ads. So that's what it used to be. So now let me raise the question. What happens when social media becomes the medium in which work is being done? And that's a very different perspective entirely. So to do this, I'm going to frame it within one of the research areas that I'm really passionate about, which are VTubers. So VTubers are virtual idols. They use 2D or 3D avatars to create content. You can see them on YouTube. You can see them on Twitch, right? And so one of the examples I'd like to give is Galgura. Galgura is a VTuber. Her employer, rather her agency, is CoverCall, which is based in Japan. And she does most of her streams on YouTube. Now, a very interesting question that I alluded to earlier on is, okay, let's ask the simpler question. Who's the employee? Which is Gura, right? It's quite easy, right? She signed a contract, she's paid by CoverCorp, she signed a contract with YouTube. Actually, we all sign contracts with YouTube. It's called terms of service, right? So now the more tougher question, who's the employer? Now you would think immediately is, oh, it's CoverCorp, because CoverCorp is paying Gura to do all of the things. But YouTube has the ability to demonetize and deplatform Gura if they feel there was a violation of terms of service. In fact, it has happened before with other VTubers. Now that there was a mistake and CoverCorp was left scrambling. Demonetization and deplatforming. I'm sorry, does that not sound like you're getting fired? Right? Which is something exclusively what employers are able to do. And what you're going to realize right now is that social media platforms, or rather I should say online web platforms like YouTube, like Twitch, like Etsy, Fiverr, all these other web platforms, you realize that they're no longer just communication tools, right? You are going to have entire industries moving forward that will be predicated centrally on the existence of social media. And right now, for example, the VTuber industry, it is predicated on the existence of YouTube and on Twitch. What is now very interesting to think about from a public policy perspective is, what is the role of government intervention? If you're going to say government intervention just simply means public policy, right? Are you going to introduce regulations and things like that? Should government intervene? If yes, how so? If not, why not? Right? That's question number one. Question number two, how do companies like CoverCorp in this instance, how do they create their own corporate policies in tandem with the fact that they have to work with YouTube? And of course, with YouTube, how do they come up with the corporate policies with their terms of service, right? And now with people like Gura, you have to understand, okay, as an individual, how do you navigate this space? It's a minefield. There are all sorts of different policies, all sorts of surprises, if you will. How do you figure this out, right? So I would say this, how important is social media going to play in the future of work? TLDR, very important.
I mean, yes, that's a I think an accurate and a great summation of the general position. I mean, we've got a couple of minutes left. And I mean, like, I feel like we could keep talking about this for another half an hour easily if we wanted to, but everyone's got time limits. So I just wanted to ask, I think maybe zooming in on, when you're talking about different collaborative technologies and talking about the future of work in this aspect, we've been talking primarily about Singapore, right? Assume that there's, I think earlier, I think Shazly inequality, and there's a pretty big disconnect between some segments of populations and others, and the capacity to access different aspects of the new future of work. And I'm not sure if this is in either of your general research or expertise roles. But what sort of work which I think maybe OGP or KYSSP within your own organizations, are there any initiatives which you guys are taking to sort of try and bridge this digital divide when it comes to being able to access the future of work?
I think it's interesting, right? When we try to think about what are the new technologies or what are new initiatives that would play a key role in future of work. Do you want my honest answer?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've only got like a minute.
The honest answer I have,
the
honest answer I have is I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know, which is the fun part, right? Okay, quick note. I think a lot of people in Singapore are very terrified about the idea of saying I don't know. Look, if you know everything, you are probably an omnipotent divine being. The reality is we're not. We're human. We're specks of dust in the cosmic wind, right? So we don't know everything. But I think that's where it's interesting, right? So again, let me go back to VTubers. The way in which they are able to operate is with something called motion capture technology. Now, you might have seen this in Avengers Infinity War and Endgame with Thanos. The same thing with the dots and they're all over the place. That's motion capture technology. Now, VTubers are able to do very similar things with their web cameras. And what is very interesting is that they are individuals. So let me give you an example. Iron Mouse. Iron Mouse is a VTuber with VShoujo agency. She does VTubing work on Twitch, and she does also content and things like that. She's gainfully employed, but guess what? She's not mobile. She can't move. She's sort of like bedbound. She has a debilitating lung disease. She can't go outside because of COVID, obviously. But she's gainfully employed. And what's really interesting is that when we start talking about these initiatives and these sort of technologies, what I think is a lot more fun is not so much about how do these things solve problems, right? We are here in the Festival of Innovation. So let's quickly talk about innovation. Innovation, first and foremost, is not just about problem solving. We like to think that it is, but it's not. Innovation is first and foremost about knowledge building. It is about exploration into the unknown. It is about pushing that boundary between what we know and what we have yet to figure out, right? And what's very interesting is that, what I think is really going to be fun here is that it's how do we see, how these innovators, some of them are in our audience as well, how do innovators use existing ideas, existing technologies, or they come up with brand new ones and they come up with cool ideas, and that's how you get your next big thing. So in terms of initiatives right now, of course, I'm looking into personally looking into food delivery riders, right? Looking at the economic model, understanding how they are operating and what's next. And so what are the public policies that you need to introduce? Same thing is true for VTubers and for content creators as well. But again, I don't want to force people into, you need to focus on this, you want to focus on that. No, go for it. Go for it and figure out what's next.
Okay, so on that note, Rahul, you have the last word. So we've got we're already over time, but you've got the last word. So as Shah said, go for it. Anything you want to add?
I think, innovation is the responsibility of everyone. If we want to take society forward, each of us has actually the power to do it. You talked about closing the digital divide. People are working on this in different ways. There are people who are moving secondhand technologies that are not being used in developed countries into places where there isn't that technology. And now because you have Shazly coming up, you have the internet hopefully going to be accessed by different people, because the reality is, if you're not connected to the internet, you are at a disadvantage. That is true. And so how do we enable people to get potentially devices that are low cost and internet that is low cost, which is happening quite a lot actually in India and in Africa? And how do you get them also, how do you connect them to the wider economy? And through those kinds of business models where you have lots of volume, actually, there are many things that are viable that we're seeing. I mean, we talked about microloans, but there are many, many other business models that are working quite well. Microinsurance is another one. And so it's really about what you want to do. Find a way to connect with the people that you need to, whether it's asynchronously or synchronously. There's many, many, many ways of doing things. We had 500 plus people volunteer from all over the world to say, hey, we heard that GovTech is working on Singapore's COVID-19 response. Let us find a way to work with you and contribute to that effort, right? So there are ways, and many of them did contribute. And so then there are different ways. So find a way that you want to contribute and go for it.
Yeah, that's a great note to end. I mean, and there's so many more questions we haven't explored. One I'm sure I've always been thinking of, and I'm sure MOF is always thinking of, is if everyone's working from everywhere, how do you tax everyone? But never mind. We are using 21st technology on 19th century institutions based on 17th century concepts. Treaty of Westphalia. But thanks so much to both our panelists. You guys have been wonderful. It's been great talking to you guys. And thanks again to our audience. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I think that's all we have for today. Thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon, or we'll see you again next year. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thanks, see you.